Hello everyone, welcome to another lecture in this food studies course. Today we move from theoretical text, that is from Lévi-Strauss and Roland Barthes, and literary essays like Lamb's Dissertation upon Roast Pig into the more popular medium of film. And not just any film, but one of the foundational food films in world cinema, the Danish Babette's Feast, directed by Gabriel Axel, based on a novella by Karen Blixen, who published it under the name Isaac Dennison. This 1987 movie won the Academy Award for Best Foreign Language Film, and it was the first Danish film ever to do so. And over the decades, it has come to occupy an almost canonical place in the genre of the food film. Along with the Japanese Tampompo, which came out in 1985, Babette's Feast is often credited with inaugurating the modern wave of serious culinary cinema, where food is the protagonist. This list would later include works such as the Taiwanese Eat, Drink, Man, Woman, the English language film Chocolate, and others. We will be dealing with many food films in this course, from world cinema to Indian regional cinema, and Babette's Feast is just the starter to this fascinating genre of food films. But what makes Babette's Feast so enduring? Why does it remain central to food studies, theology, film studies, and aesthetic theory? Today, I want us to approach the film on four intertwined levels: the aesthetic and culinary transformation, the religious and theological dimension of grace, the psychoanalytic work of mourning, and finally the filmic language, how cinema itself makes us taste without tasting. At this moment, I would urge you strongly to watch the film not simply for the sake of this lecture, but also because it's a delightful watch that will help you make connections with other food films that we are used to, even in the Indian context. Before we engage with the film, we must situate Babette's Feast historically. Since this is the first food film we are analyzing in this course, let us think about what makes a food film. If food film is a genre at all, if so, when did it emerge? And why it emerged and when it did? As Laura Lindenfeld and Fabio Parascoli argue in their book Feasting Our Eyes, Food Films and Cultural Identity in the United States, food has always appeared in cinema. One of the earliest films ever made, the Lumiere brothers' Le Repas du Bébé, simply shows a baby being fed. In silent cinema, food often functioned as physical comedy. For example, think about whipped cream pies being thrown or slipping on banana peels and other slapstick eating scenes. For decades, food functioned as a comic device, a symbol of poverty or excess, and as a marker of class. Exceptions to these include Chaplin's famous shoe-eating scene in The Gold Rush, which also encoded a commentary on class. Nonetheless, food was rarely the narrative center. While food was more important in the European cinema of the 1970s, they still remained symbolic or satirical, rarely celebratory. For example, La Grande Bouffe by Marco Ferreri depicts bourgeois excess and self-destruction. However, the 1980s mark a turning point in this attitude. During this period, global food cultures began circulating rapidly, celebrity chefs rose to prominence, food media expanded dramatically, middle-class consumer culture intensified, and food studies as a discipline began gaining academic legitimacy. The confluence of these multiple forces slowly but surely led to food becoming identity and instilled a refreshed centering of food within film narratives. According to Lindenfeld and Parascoli, the food film emerges when cuisine becomes a way of negotiating belonging, taste, and cultural citizenship. These films do not simply show meals, they construct relationships between food and self-food. Food started encoding a lot more meaning than just being used as props. In this sense, Babette's Feast is pivotal. It dignifies cooking as art. It slows down the camera, it invites contemplation, It treats food not as background but as an event. Let's also think about the term that people started attributing to movies like Babette's Feast and Tampopo, that of food film. If it is a genre, what are its conventions? According to genre theorists and critics, a food film has food driving the narrative. Chefs or cooks as central characters, camera lingering on food, sensual close-ups, meals being turning points in the narrative, and importantly, food mediating identity, power, and relationships. In that sense, Babette's Feast helped stabilize the category of the food film. From above conventions, we can understand that the implications of the category of food film is not just thematic but also aesthetic. Lindenfeld and Parasicoli discuss the emergence of what critics call food porn. This does not mean obscenity, but it refers to a certain visual language which consists of extreme close-ups, amplified sound, glossy lighting, fetishistic texture shots, steam, glisten, dripping sauces, etc. Food is sexualized visually. Cooking scenes developed a grammar with ingredient close-up, knife skills shot, stirring motion, chef's concentrated face, and wide kitchen reveal. These techniques are now standard, and Babette's Feast's significance also comes from the fact that it is one of the earliest films to consolidate this visual vocabulary, and later movies refined it. The food shots in the movie defined the aesthetic template of a food film. However, I believe that unlike the movies that would come after, Babette's Feast does not hide the less palatable aspects of cooking like food waste. There are scenes where we see the head of a cow and bones being carried off. This is often not so the case with later movies that seek to highlight sanitized kitchens and has very little to do with food waste. Now, let's begin our film analysis. The film is set in the 19th century Jutland in a remote Protestant village defined by pietistic austerity. Two elderly sisters, Martine and Philippa, continue the spiritual mission of their late father, who established the local church. In their youth, both had suitors. Martine was courted by the Swedish officer Lawrence Lowenheim and Philippa by the French singer Achille Papin, but both renounced romantic and artistic futures in favor of religious devotion. The visual language of the early part of the film establishes this world immediately. Take a look at the cinematic frames. It features muted greys and browns and sparse interiors, long static shots, wind-swept dunes, and bare wooden tables, all of which create a mood of an austere and detached life. As I already mentioned, the film is an adaptation of a story which was originally set in a Norwegian village, but Axel moves the setting to Denmark, specifically to the west coast of Jutland. In an interview with Ib Bondem-Jerk, Axel explained that the decision was visual. The Norwegian town was too pastel colored and too picturesque. He needed somberness, grey skies, harsh winds, muted dunes, so that the eventual transformation of the feast would register with full intensity. This change in location depends on contrast. Axel tones everything down, as he put it, so that the feast can conclude with elan. The aesthetic strategy mirrors the narrative arc. Modesty first, radiance later. Deepening Blixen's vision in its filmic adaptation, we can see that Axel's cinema is also a masterclass in cinematic translation. Now, coming to the food itself, in these early scenes, we can see that it is filmed almost anti-sensually, with food being soaked dried fish, bread soup, thin ale. The camera does not linger lovingly. There is no sensual close-up. Eating is functional, not pleasurable. Through this, the film establishes a theological suspicion of pleasure through mise-en-scène. Into this world arrives Babette Hersent, played by Stéphane Audran, a refugee of the Paris Commune. She carries a letter of introduction from Papin. We later learned that she was once the head chef at the legendary Café Anglais in Paris. Immediately, we have a collision between Parisian haute cuisine and Nordic Protestant austerity. But the film does not stage this as a dramatic conflict. Instead, it unfolds quietly, almost imperceptibly, as Babette adapts to this small, dwindling village. Let's turn our eyes to the slow transformation that Hoch Wiesel calls culinary turn. Most viewers assume that the transformation occurs at the spectacular feast near the end. But Wiesel argues that the real transformation begins much earlier. For 14 years, Babette cooks the sisters' austere meals. Yet the film subtly shows change. There is a sick villager dissatisfied when someone else prepares the soup. We see Babette smelling onions before purchasing them, showing a certain discernment with food particularities that would be the least of concerns for the austere community she serves. She is also seen haggling over fresh fish and experimenting with herbs. The camera lingers slightly longer on chopping, stirring, and simmering. The rhythm changes. So, the culinary turn is more gradual than one assumes. Babette recognizes that exile does not mean replication. She cannot reproduce Paris. She must respond to Jutland. Wiesel, in his work Babette's Culinary Turn, an essay, situates her historically between the nouvelle cuisine in France and what we now call New Nordic cuisine. She becomes a kind of proto-New Nordic chef embracing regional specificity. In this sense, exile for Babette becomes productive. She reinvents herself through agricultural adaptation. The sisters even remark, "Since Babette has been here, we have been spending far less money." This line is crucial as it signals not just thrift but artistic recalibration where her art becomes economically embedded. She accepts local terroir. As Babette navigates her life in this village for about 14 years, she wins a lottery of 10,000 francs. Here, the narrative could easily become melodramatic. She could return to Paris to reclaim her older life, but she does not. Instead, she proposes to cook a French dinner to commemorate the church's founding father's 100th birthday. That is the centenary birthday of Martin and Philippa's father. At this point, you will notice how the film changes visually. Pay close attention to the cinematography. The color palette and the rhythm of the movie transform at this point. The feast preparation is shot almost like a ritual choreography with the arrival of turtles, the live quails, the enormous blocks of ice, the champagne bottles, and the rich red wines. The color palette also shifts dramatically. Deep burgundies, golds, luminous whites take over the grays of the earlier parts of the film. You will also notice how the table is framed symmetrically, how the candles glow and see the faces soften. It is as if we are invited into a sensory peek without ever tasting. Coming to the menu itself of Babette's feast, she goes all the way to recreate her former Paris repertoire. The menu includes turtle soup, blanis demi-off with caviar, kale on sarcophage, baba au rum. The arrival of the ingredients from Paris as per the directions of Babette concerns the villagers who think that such indulgences in sensual pleasures are sin. So they decide not to say anything to Babette or comment on the food but rather just eat and go. Only General Lowenheim, who is rather an outsider in the community and isn't privy to the plan of the villagers, recognizes the dishes because he once dined at Café Anglais. His recognition produces one of the film's key speeches, where he speaks of grace, mercy, and possibility. Here, we can see something important happening to the villagers who have vowed not to comment on the food in an attempt to neutralize pleasure through silence. Their bodies betray them. They start to smile, relax, drink, and begin to speak with each other more amicably in contrast with the previous congregational meeting where there were disagreements. We can understand how food precedes theology at this moment and even rejuvenates the community. For this reason, a dominant reading of Babette's feast has been spiritual or religious. Let's look at that a little more closely. We know that of late there have been disagreements and small quarrels amongst the congregation. It is at such a point that Babette welcomes everyone to her grand feast, and the same group gets transformed through her food. People who displayed restraint in everything are suddenly more free and friendly with each other, and the shared grand meal repairs the community relations. The food brings back the bond. Again, you must not have missed out on the many theological interpretations that see Babette as a Christ-like figure. There is sacramental grace in the dinner which resembles the Last Supper, where she gives everything she has, while she herself remains materially poor. But the film complicates pure sacrifice. When Babette reveals that she spent all her winnings, she says, "An artist is never poor." This is not self-annihilation, it is affirmation. Interestingly, Pope Francis has cited Babette's Feast as one of his favorite films, precisely because it illustrates joy through self-giving generosity. But here is what is radical. Grace arrives not through doctrine, but through taste. It is the body that leads the spirit. This resonates with Bert Olivier's argument that the film collapses the body-spirit divide. Pleasure is not sinful, it is redemptive. We may even understand this divide in clothing. The community dresses in dull colors while the general stands in sharp contrast with his blue military uniform. He stands up to give a speech during the meal, and we see that spirit as represented by the community is displaced by the body. That is represented by the man of the world, the general. And his speech also hints at the union of the two forces. Marc Le Fanu also insists that the film's quality is spiritual but not dogmatic. While there is satire of sectarian narrowness, it is gentle. Neither does the film simply endorse Epicureanism, nor does it merely mock religion. It reveals that Puritan Christianity and embodied Christianity need not be enemies. The villagers vow not to speak about the food. Yet they soften, reconcile, confess over the food. The general speech culminates. Mercy and truth have met together. Righteousness and bliss have kissed one another. Food here becomes the site where opposites meet. On a similar line, we can see that this community is creatively and artistically repressed. Philippa does not get to be a famous singer in spite of being a great one. The community generates nothing much and looks on all worldly passions, including creativity, with suspicion. In fact, the lack of children in the movie is also a clue to their barrenness, as they are rather puritanical in their biblical interpretations. But we know that the Bible is full of feast, celebrating God's creativity, bountifulness, and generative quality. In the movie, it is Babette's feast, which is an act of creativity that puts back some of that generative energy into the community, telling them that sensual joy is also important and needn't necessarily be held against spirituality. Esther Rashkin offers an interesting and radically different reading of the feast in the movie. She suggests the feast is not merely aesthetic but psychoanalytic. Throughout this course, we will come across psychoanalysis as a framework to understand food in films, society, and literature. So, the following will come in handy for our future lectures as well. Rashkin notes that in Babette's feast, everyone has suffered losses. Babette lost her husband and son in the commune. The general lost Martin. Philippa lost Papin and her career, and the sisters lost their father. Yet no one has really mourned the loss. The village is full of unspoken resentments. Rashkin reads the feast as a symbolic Eucharist, not literal Catholic transubstantiation, but a Protestant metaphor. When the general eats the quail in pastry, he symbolically consumes his lost love, and for the first time he admits vulnerability. Never till now had the general stated that he trembled. Food becomes speech. Food resolves old losses and reinitiates dialogue between the people. In psychoanalytic terms, incorporation is swallowing loss without processing, while introjection implies digesting loss through language. The feast becomes a language that allows introjection, that is, the digestion of losses. After Babette's feast, the villagers who till then were bickering in an uptight fashion also reconcile. They speak openly. Old grievances dissolve. We may also add that through the material act of the feast, Babette also regains, at least fleetingly, her old self. Once again, through the medium of food, the film moves from silence to speech, repression to expression, and isolation to community. We must now ask, how does the film make us experience food without smell or taste? Consider the cinematography of Babette's feast. We see close-ups of ladles pouring soup, of steam rising, of the crack of pastry crust and the glistening sauce. Then comes the sound design which amplifies texture even more. The crunch of crust, the fizz of champagne and the scrape of cutlery. However, unlike many contemporary food films, the camera does not eroticize, it sacralizes. Films are often even more capable of making us experience food than the written story itself. The acts of the characters also contribute to this. A memorable scene in the film is when it shows the quail's bald heads propped up in a pastry coffins before baking, and later the general cracks the skull delicately and sucks out the brain with urban etiquette, making the audience also experience the food. At this point, it is important to bring out a key production detail in this food film. The director, Axel, insisted on authenticity. For the meal, everything was ordered from Paris. It was real caviar, real truffles, real porcelain and silver. The feast had to be truly grandiose and was also in this case edible. This attention to detail makes the scene even more real and truly a treat to the audience. And this feeling is heightened because till then everything in the movie was restrained. However, when we compare this to Tambopo, which we will deal with in more detail in the coming lecture, we see that ramen is shot sensually, humorously and even erotically. Tambopo embraces food as a playful desire. It emerged during Japan's 1980s consumer boom when food culture became aspirational and urban. Babette's feast, by contrast, is elegiac. It looks backward to 19th century Europe, to a lost France, to a pre-industrial ritual. Yet both films emerge in the 1980s, a moment when global cinema begins foregrounding food as cultural text. Let us now move on to some other thoughts regarding the film. The original story emphasizes Babette's identity as a communard. The Paris Commune, a group of revolutionaries who held power in Paris for 72 days, were later brutally suppressed. We understand that Babette was in exile due to this suppression, but the film softens this political dimension. It downplays references to General Galifet, the butcher of the Commune. The film also ages the sisters, making the tone more elegiac than ironic. This shift and suppression of selected political aspects matter. Omissions matter and indicate what the film prioritizes. The film foregrounds aesthetic and spiritual reconciliation over political antagonism. Food becomes a universal mediator, perhaps too universal. In this respect, we may attempt a counter-reading or critique of the film here, questioning the erasure of class struggle in favor of harmony. Does it aestheticize trauma? Yet even this softening may reflect the historical moment of the release of the films, 1980s, when Europe desired post-war reconciliation and cultural healing. In this line of political reading, Marc Le Fanu suggests that the film can be read as feminist text. Babette is after all a communard refugee. an artist and a freedom fighter. She makes a livelihood adapting rather well to her dire circumstances at a time when such things were not expected or afforded to women. She also has absolute control over her money. When she wins the lottery, she spends everything not for romantic fulfillment or male validation but for artistic integrity. Her declaration, "An artist is never poor," affirms sovereignty. Babette demonstrates that the artist responds to adversity with generosity and style. Lindenfeld and Parasicoli note that the rise of food films corresponds with food anxiety around issues like obesity, industrial agriculture, health panics, ethical consumption, and income inequality. Food films often respond by offering comforting utopias, and Babette's Feast can be viewed as one such utopia. It presents abundance without guilt and sensuality without sin. We have already seen how the film has chosen to not highlight the revolutionary being that Babette is. We may critique and question this smoothing over, but that smoothing is part of what made the film globally resonant. To conclude, so far we saw the transformations with reference to food in Babette's Feast. This culinary turn is geographic as there is a move from France to Jutland. The turn is aesthetic as Babette lets go of the haute cuisine of her earlier days to adapt to regional cuisines. The culinary turn is also psychic as the trauma is vended and losses mourned. Finally, the turn is spiritual as the silence of the community is replaced by grace through Babette's grand feast. When Babette stays at Jutland, she accepts exile. Paris is gone and so is her old life. But art persists, and that is all that a true artist craves. When the art is cooking, we can see that Babette's Feast dignifies cooking as an aesthetic practice. It asserts that cooking is art, that it is memory, mourning, and spiritual mediation. Cooking is a signifying practice. The movie ends on a very hopeful note with the final outdoor scene where the villagers are holding hands in a circle under the night sky. The framing is rather cosmic. The camera pulls back, the wind still blows, but something has shifted. There is hope that in this beautiful world of ours, all things are possible. And the transformation came not through sermon, but through soup. So, as we move forward in this module, and especially when we compare this film to Tambopo, I want you to keep asking, when food appears on screen, is it nourishment? Is it nationalism? Is it mourning? Is it desire? Is it grace? Or is it all of these at once? What does the food actually do in the movie? How does cinema evoke taste indirectly? What does the close-up camera techniques, the gestures of the characters, and the sound design indicate? We must learn to look at food in films not just thematically but also formally by analyzing the technical choices as well. Because they are all ways that the camera teaches us how to look at a movie. Babette's Feast is foundational as it tells us that cooking is never merely cooking. It is always already culture, memory, and meaning. In our next lecture, we will discuss another food film called Tambopo. Thank you for listening.